Okay, let's get started. So today we are doing our midterm review. Oh, God. Okay, so what my plan is to first go through the quizzes that we haven't yet covered, then go over the practice midterms, or at least the problems that are relevant to this class. After that, I'll just quickly on the iPad go through the whole pipeline at a high level, from like training a language model to using it at test time to generate text, to all the different ways we covered to apply these models to downstream tasks. And then I will take any questions that you have, or happy to focus on more on particular problems if I didn't explain them clearly. Okay, so before we start, some logistics stuff that I didn't mention last time. So okay, I assume this is working. The exam will be released as an overleaf template, as I mentioned. If you have questions about the exam, you should ask them as private Piazza posts. Any public posts will be deleted. If we keep getting the same question over and over again, like maybe there's a typo or something that's really not clear at all, then myself or the TAs will make a public post clarifying it for everyone. But you should keep all your posts private. Also, I should mention that some people have got extensions to take the exam the week after. So please don't post any discussion about the exam even after it's completed until all of the students have taken it. So we will send an update when everyone in the class has taken the exam. I mean, if you do discuss the exam with these people, then possibly they would get higher scores than you, which would ruin the curve. So you should keep that in mind. All right. So for people on YouTube, it says it's not receiving video to maintain smooth streaming. Let me know if there's any issues, although I don't know what I can do about that at this point. Okay, so let's get started with first the quizzes. So there's quiz 5 and quiz 6 that we haven't covered yet. So quiz 5 was about the ELI5 dataset, which we later discussed the following week. Essentially, this task is a text generation task in which you're supposed to generate a paragraph-long answer given some sort of question. And so we would have accepted any answer that involved taking some sort of language model, conditioning it on data crawled from this subreddit to produce the right answer. You could go into much more detail on how exactly to do this. You could have chosen to include a retrieval style module that retrieves articles from Wikipedia and then conditions your generated text on that. But essentially this, like many tasks that we've talked about so far, like machine translation or story generation or whatever, is a conditional text generation task. It's a conditional language modeling task, right? You have a language model and you want it to produce text conditioned not only on the words that it's already generated, but also on some input context, in this case, the question, right? And possibly some retrieved documents. So that's all we were looking for. On your midterm, if you were asked a question like this, you would probably require much more detail, as you probably saw in one of the practice midterms, where we ask you to go describe step by step how you build a model for a related task. So we'll talk about that more later on. Okay, so the next question was focused on evaluation, since we did spend some time talking about that as well. So the question describes that you have the system, you go to Mechanical Turk, you put some answers that your model generated on Mechanical Turk along with the questions, and then you ask the Mechanical Turkers, these are like crowdsourced workers, to rate how correct the model generated answer is on a scale of 1 to 5. And the question asks, what are some issues with this setup? So what are some obvious issues with this setup? Maybe not so obvious. Okay.
Based on the study that you showed, people just kind of randomly click through things on Mechanical Turk without really spending enough time to evaluate it properly.
Sure. So there are Mechanical Turk specific, like platform specific issues with things like the workers not reading text, right? They spend too few seconds per answer. There's no way they're going to be able to judge correctness from just not even looking at the answer and just randomly clicking things. So that's definitely one issue.
The other thing that was sort of mentioned in the previous lecture was the scale of 1 to 5 doesn't have a rubric, so it doesn't, like, you don't know what 1 means or what 5 means, and it could be different for each.
Exactly. So even if the workers were fully reading this and trying to do their best effort, they may not know what a 1 is or what a 5 is. Those aren't properly calibrated. So even if they're trying their best, they might have a lot of disagreement with each other because they each selected their own internal rubric for doing this task. Definitely another issue. Other problems? Yeah, so maybe you should provide your workers with the reference answer so they have a better idea of what the correct answer should look like. And that's the larger problem with this task, right? Like, if you have a question about, I don't know, fixing a toilet and the Mechanical Turk worker has no idea how to fix a toilet, how are they going to be able to judge the correctness of this answer? And it might even be hard if you provide reference answers for them to even understand the terminology and so on. So this is a very difficult problem to evaluate it through crowdsourced workers. That's the highlight. So there are many possible reasons here. Okay, so any questions about these two problems? Yeah.
In this particular case, is it also going to be a problem that we randomly sample only once? Like we're saying we're randomly sampling 500 questions from the test set. The fact that we do it only once, and that's a approximation of.
Yeah, so possibly you might want to take more questions. That's a less important issue because maybe you have 500 questions, but you get 10 ratings per question or something. So there's always ways to, even if you have limited data, you can get a better sense of the statistical significance by getting a lot more raters as well. Yeah, so I would say that could be an issue, but the other ones are much more severe here. Okay, so let's move on to quiz 6, which was talking about these kinds of retrieval-based models. So the first question here was a kind of ridiculous way of doing story generation, where you take every single sentence that exists in the common crawl, you embed it using something like BERT. So we know how to embed things with BERT, right? We pass it through BERT. We can take the CLS representation as a global representation of that whole input. Or we can do things like take the average of all of the token level vectors at the final layer and consider that as our representation. Either way, we get some vector, single vector that represents each of these sentences, and then we decide that we're not going to do any sort of text generation at all. Instead, given some prompt, we're just going to keep retrieving sentences from this giant data store and kind of hope that they form a coherent story. So what are some issues that people thought of? There's so many, right?
There's enormous amount of computation that we require because every time we want to retrieve the main document, we have to kind of compute the dot product of the document, the dot product, and this has to be done for a lot of syntax.
Sure. So every time we want to produce a sentence, we have to do this inner product search over our entire billions and billions of sentences data store, which is slow, but it's also feasible. I mean, the K nearest neighbors language model we looked at in the retrieval lecture does this at every time step of the language model, so before every token. So sure, it is expensive. That's definitely a drawback, but yeah.
Finding maximum end product results doesn't actually make it coherent because it could be sentences that are all like the water is wet, the water is very wet. It doesn't tell a story.
Right. So especially as you add more and more retrieved sentences to your story, you're likely just going to keep retrieving sentences that are similar to things that you've retrieved in the past. But of course, that's not what makes a good story, right? If you see 100 different variations of the water is wet, that's maybe interesting from like a postmodern perspective, but not from what, I guess I didn't specify that in this question, but it's not what I was intending. So sure, that's an issue. Did you have any others?
A model might get stuck in a loop and repeat the same sentence again and again.
That is possible. Yeah, it could keep retrieving the same sentence over and over again, depending on what the prompt is, and maybe the prompt is, maybe the prompt is itself very similar to some sentences in the data store. Other issues?
I would say that like if you have a vectorization of many sentences, it's not really fair to compare that to vectorization of single sentences, but they might represent different structures in the data.
Sure. I mean, this is there's a broader issue here, which is at some point you'll run out of tokens that you can put into BERT, right, to do this encoding of the prompt plus all the context. So yeah, and there is the issue that you bring up, like you can't, we know, and maybe we didn't cover this in the class, but there's research work that shows that BERT is not good for embedding things like sentences because its pre-training objective is on much longer chunks. So comparing a sentence embedding to like some big paragraph embedding is not likely to be worthwhile, at least with a pre-trained model. So another issue here is that because you're not generating text, you might get cases where the retrieved sentence, even if it makes sense and it makes sense as a continuation of the story, like in the context of the like local coherence between that sentence and the previous one, it might not make sense, right? So if I have a character in my story, like Bob, for example, and I said, you know, Bob went to the store, and then the next retrieved sentence is something like, he tried to buy a gallon of milk. And then in the next retrieved sentence, it was something like Jim paid up at the register, right? So since I'm retrieving, I don't have control over, like the model doesn't, it might not know, depending on the quality of the representations, that it's very important that Bob is preserved throughout all of these sentences, right? So this kind of like coherence issue is a big issue with this kind of setup, where if you're just retrieving random sentences from the internet, it's not a given that you'll be able to find some sequence of these sentences that makes complete sense without any of these weird artifacts. So, okay, many issues here. The second question here is a good tie-in to one of the midterm questions, the one from last year. So here it says you implement a 16-layer transformer language model with local attention. So remember, in local attention, we are simply only considering the last like k tokens in our self-attention, and we're ignoring all of the other tokens. And this happens in every layer. And we discussed how, despite the fact that we're only doing the self-attention over a fixed size block of k tokens, as we increase the depth of the network, the effective receptive field, if you want to call it that, of this model extends past whatever k is. So this question was essentially asking you what is the scaling of this local attention, and whether or not in this particular setup, if you have 10,000 tokens in your input, whether or not all of these tokens will be fully contextualized at the final layer. Like they'll have the position at 9,999 will have information about the token at position 1. So in this case, like one easy way to visualize this is to draw kind of what the attention is focusing on at every layer. So I could do this on the iPad if that would be helpful, but essentially the attention scales linearly with the number of layers. So at any layer L, the number of tokens under that, at a specific position, the number of tokens that you can look back at with local attention is k times L, where k is the fixed window size of the self-attention, the local attention. And it's fairly easy to visualize that. So if, let's say, the local attention window is 10, so I'm only looking back 10 tokens in the past, at the very first layer, I will only have information about those previous 10 tokens, right? I don't have any other access to any of the other things in the past. But at the second layer, if you take the token representation that is 10 tokens away from your current position, that token representation has information about the previous 10 tokens now because it's already been through one round of local attention. So now in the second layer, the original position has access to 20 tokens of context and so on. So this is how this model scales. And if you do the math here, 16 times 256 is like 4,096. It's not enough to represent the 10,000 tokens. Okay, so this is just another way of asking the first question on last year's midterm as well. So I can switch over to that. It's one of these random files. Maybe this one. Yeah, this one. Oh, I should see if there are YouTube. Oh. Okay, that's not true. See, in the story generation question, because we're pre-computing embeddings, won't stale indices be a problem? I see what. So I guess the question is actually asking about stale embeddings. But yeah, I mean, here there are so many other problems with that setup that I don't think this is the biggest one. But for sure, maybe an ideal model would be fine-tuning the embeddings alongside the story generation task, using that as an objective function. So I'll get to this question about the social security number thing when we get to that in the practice midterm. Okay, so for this question, first of all, how many of you have looked through these practice midterms? All right, so some of you have not. So basically, the goal of this question, Sarah is trying to train a trigram model. So remember, a trigram model is one that at every time step, I can only look at the last 2 tokens. A trigram model, the one that we learned about at least, was a count-based model. So I would keep a big table of all possible 2-word phrases that I've seen in my training data set and count up all the continuations, all of the possible next words that I observed that occurred after each of these 2-word phrases, right? So that's how and then I normalized that big table, and that's how I got my trigram model. So in this question, it's really asking, how do I implement the same kind of setup where at every token I can only have access to the previous 2 tokens for doing language modeling? How can I do that within a transformer setup? And so this mask here you should be familiar with. This is the standard transformer self-attention mask in the decoder at training time, right? We discussed why this mask is needed so that we can parallelize all of the computations of the decoder. And this is only possible because we know the ground truth next words in training time. So this mask is irrelevant at test time because we have to go step by step predicting the next word. We don't have anything in the future to mask, right? Because we haven't seen the future at test time. So anyway, this is the default mask. But Sarah, if you look at this, she changed it to just be local attention with k equals 2. So last year I didn't cover local attention because it wasn't really a thing yet. I mean, it seems obvious, right, that it should be a thing, but no one had done like the detailed experiments into local attention at that time. But now this problem is exactly just asking about local attention. So here, the constraint k equals 2, right, the local window, and we're not attending to anything outside of that window. So if you look at the next part of this question, it says, Sarah thinks that with this new decoder mask, the model is only attending over the previous 2 tokens in the decoder, so it must be equivalent to like a trigram model, at least in the information that's seen. Of course, we now know from that quiz question and from our talk about local attention that that's not true at all, right? As you get more and more layers, your receptive field is increasing, and her model has 16 layers, so actually she's seeing 32 tokens at that final layer, not 3 tokens. But it doesn't just say that the model is, doing better than she expected, right? It says that the validation perplexity is 25, and her base model with the full attention has a validation perplexity of 20. So remember that a lower perplexity means the model is doing a better job at predicting the training, the validation data here. So if you train a trigram model, you would expect the perplexity to be a lot higher, right? Because you've lost so much context compared to the full model. And you can look back at those lectures we had on n-gram models to see the difference as you increase n, right? How much the perplexity drops. But you might expect a trigram transformer model to be like 100 perplexity or something much higher. But here it's only 25. And basically this is a cue to make you think that this isn't actually a trigram model. It has access to much more context. So yeah, that was the answer. This problem was very tricky for the last year's class, but probably should be straightforward for you all since we've now covered local attention. Of course, I'm not going to ask this question. Okay, so the next question was basically, if you actually want to implement something like a trigram model where every time step the model only ever has access to the previous 2 tokens and no other tokens, how would you do that? So here we came up with 2 solutions. The first one is super simple. All you do is change the way in which your data is formatted. So the data in a normal language model, right, is just the sequences of tokens up to some max sequence length, right? And you give it batches of these sequences. And the mask is really there so this mask is only necessary because the input sequences are longer than 2 tokens, right? But what if you made all of your inputs 2 tokens long, and you just said, all right, the model will get these 2 tokens, and we're only going to look at its prediction of the next word. We don't have to do any masking at all. We can just say, for every example, predict the next word given these 2 tokens. This is obviously less efficient, because now for every input, you're only doing 1 prediction at the end of the sequence. And you have a lot more inputs now, because what used to be like 100 token input sequence, you now chopped up into individual segments of 2 tokens each, right? So you're gonna have a lot more input data. This approach is interesting to analyze its complexity because the self-attention complexity is now not a thing. You've reduced the sequence length to just 2, so we're not too concerned about that. But it's that any minor savings you get from reducing the self-attention complexity is completely wiped out by the fact that you've multiplied your training data by some huge number. You're only getting 1 prediction per example. So this is, in practice, going to be a lot slower than training the normal transformer model. The other approach is much simpler. Oh, yeah, go ahead. At test time, we'll have to calculate the next word prediction for the entire sequence length. Sure.
But then how I can't understand why the new method is slower than the previous one.
So slower during training time, not at test time. Although it probably is slower at, well, no, it's the same at
The same at test time.
it's probably faster at test time because because at test time, both models have to do the prediction step by step. Yeah, but training time is what I was talking about. Okay, so the second method is simpler conceptually, I guess, but it's also probably worse than the first method that I just described, which is You use this mask at the very first layer of the network because you know at the first layer there's no leakage from any of the tokens outside this window. And then at the 2nd through 16th layer, you just have basically a diagonal. The diagonals are 1s and everything else is 0. So every time step can only attend to that time step, which is essentially just saying you're doing a bunch of feed-forward layers over the initial layer's computation. So only the first layer is allowed to look at the previous 2 tokens. The subsequent layers are just applying the feed-forward layer on top of that representation because they can't attend to any other token's representation. So this is another solution that we accepted. It has the same complexity as the solution that Sarah proposed, the local attention or the baseline transformer. The only thing you've changed is the mask, right? So yeah. Okay, so those were 2 solutions. And then depending on your solution, your answer would be different for this question. Of course, if you're modifying the data, as we discussed, you have way more input examples because you've now chopped them up into these shorter segments. So it's going to be slower. The other one is going to be roughly the same training time. Okay, so you should expect a oh yeah, go ahead. Can you reduce? Oh yeah, that I think there was something in this question that said don't modify the architecture. Maybe I'm lying. Oh yeah, here. Make sure that, so you had to use, but yeah, if you were allowed to modify the architecture, you could just say, we'll make a 1-layer transformer that has the mask, right? And that would have been acceptable. Okay, oh, let me check the YouTube. Okay, no more. Okay, so you should expect a question like this one that's kind of more open-ended, where we give you some data set and tell you to build a model for this data set and evaluate it. It's at least very reasonable that such a question would be on your exam. So here we have this QA task of hypothetical questions. There's actually a whole subreddit about these. So, you know, what would you do if toilet paper is $20 a roll? It's probably like close to a reality now. But anyway, so first we asked you to describe some differences between this task and squad. This task is a generative QA task like ELI5, the one we just saw in the quiz. So squad, remember, gives you a passage where the answer exists and asks you to pull out that answer. So the entire objective here is different, right? You have much more open-ended questions. It's harder to evaluate. You don't have any ground truth passage where the answer is guaranteed to be. There are many other differences. You could have looked at the types of questions. Squad has very few to no hypothetical questions. The type of reasoning required to solve these questions. There's a lot of potential differences that you could have covered. So yeah, this was a fairly straightforward question. And then this one is asking you to build essentially from data collection, pre-processing, model training, evaluation. I guess evaluation was the next question. But what would you do for this, this particular task? And we didn't write out an answer because there's so many possible answers. But one very reasonable thing to do is start with a pre-trained language model. So something like GPT-2 or some of the other ones we've seen, like a routing transformer, whatever, and fine-tune it on this data set specifically. So that would be a very reasonable modeling decision to do. There's more interesting stuff you could do with the pre-processing, right? So it tells you here that you've crawled these subreddits and collected 10,000 questions along with all of the posted answers to these questions. So when you're training your model, you need to decide what is the output that you're going to show the model for every input, since you have multiple answers. So you could have chosen to, for example, use the most upvoted answer to show the model. You could have also said, I will show all of the answers to the model, but this has very different behavior that's kind of hard to predict. You could have said, I'll choose the longest answer, right? But you needed to do something because we didn't do all the pre-processing for you in the problem setup. So input and output format, right? This is the most reasonable way to do this is formulated as a text-to-text problem, right? So even T5 would be a perfect model for this, right? You put the question into the encoder and fine-tune the decoder to produce the answers to the questions. So a lot of people somehow got confused on this and said things like, we will use BERT to produce the answer, which is way too vague, also not possible, really. It's unclear how you would use BERT to produce an answer to this, but maybe if you thought this task was like Squad for some reason, then, but yeah, I mean, it is very clearly supposed to be a generative problem where you need to generate text to solve it. Yeah. It's unclear what that would do. So in general, if you imagine your questions have one-word answers, so let's say I had this this question, and then some of the answers were like run or die or something like that. So if I had those two answers and I included both of them in my training data, the optimal solution for the model would be to put 50% probability on run and 50% on die. But it's hard to extend that intuition to what happens with multiple tokens per answer. I think ideally the model would put half its probability on one of the answers and half on the other, but of course we know it's hard for the model to learn to do that. It's going to assign a lot of probability to many other places as well. But yeah, it's not clear what that would do during sampling. Maybe it would be good, yeah, we just wanted you to acknowledge the fact that there were multiple answers and do something or don't do something about it.
For this second question, how should we decide the model? Like, should we just, since this is a generative task, is it okay to pick any generative model?
Yeah, but you have to justify your decision, right? So if you said, for example, I would train like transformer language model from scratch on this data, you would probably lose points because there's no way to justify doing that over starting with a pre-trained model and fine-tuning it. You don't have that many examples, right? You only have 10,000 training examples. Your language model is probably not even going to learn to generate grammatical text if you train it from scratch on such little data. So there is, if you're choosing between something like GPT-2 and T5, it's hard to say, but definitely at that level, like a pre-trained versus not pre-trained model, we would want you to justify that choice. Yeah. Okay, and then this question was also kind of geared to get you thinking about how automatic evaluations are not really there yet for this kind of task. So just as a refresher, let's say you're using a conditional language model to solve this task. What would be the most informative automatic metric that you could compute to measure how well your model is doing here? A what? Rouge? Yeah. Okay, so you could compute the Rouge score against the reference. You could do this, but it has many issues, right? Because there's such variance in these answers. A lot of them are subjective, right? This particular example question, it depends on the person, right? Some people might not react at all. Other people might do wild things, right? So if your references don't have high coverage, then Rouge is probably not a good evaluation metric, or other like string overlap type methods. Other choices?
We can use a two-step approach. One would be to use CFIDF to measure the similarity between the answers, and one would be to use perplexity from a language model to check how coherent our answer is.
So the first one has the same issue that with the Rouge score. Like using TF-IDF, you're not going to get that much word overlap. Even if your generated answer is valid, if it's not covered in the set of reference answers, you're not going to get a high score for that answer, right? The other thing you said is correct, though. If you have a validation set, you can measure your model's perplexity on that validation set and compare it to some other model to see how well your model stacks up. So perplexity is definitely the best metric if you have one of these kinds of generative tasks on these open-ended problems. So of course, with things like machine translation, blue score is informative, right? And you should compute that and rely on it more than you would perplexity. But on something like this, where blue, rouge, word overlap things are less reliable, perplexity is definitely the most informative thing that you have. So yeah, that would be, but of course, in this case, perplexity is no substitute for a human evaluation of the answer quality. And so you could do, ask people to evaluate the relevance, fluency, coherence, so on, using all of the tricks that we learned about how to properly set up these kinds of evaluations. So, I mean, we accepted a lot of potential answers here, as long as you mentioned that human evaluation is likely to be the most informative for this task. You probably got most of the points. Okay, yeah. Yeah, or you could take the lowest perplexity answer and use that in your computation as well. Okay, so some YouTube questions. Any math behind why the approach with shorter sequences and more input is slower than the mask approach? Yeah, that depends on the hardware and stuff like that too. But in general, although the theoretical complexity is bounded by the self-attention, and so you might expect it to be shorter with the shorter, take less time with the shorter sequences. In practice, if you have a lot of layers and feed-forward computations, the more inputs that you have, more input examples, that's going to start to dominate the time. So it is kind of dependent on the hardware and the exact hyperparameters you choose. But yeah, if you want, we can discuss it further in office hours or something. Okay, for the open-ended QA task, would a retrieval-based system that was conditioned over a corpus like Wikipedia and then a text generation component be a valid answer? Yeah, so for this, I assume you're talking about this hypothetical, what are we in? Hypothetical question generation task. A retrieval module might help for certain types of questions. This one I'm not so sure about, but maybe if you retrieved a site that had normal toilet paper prices, it would be easy for the model to detect that this is actually an unusually high value or something like that. So it could help with common sense understanding as well. Yeah, that would be a perfectly acceptable solution. Okay, so let's go to the next question here. So this one was a little bit tricky. Here, if you saw on the other midterms, we asked questions about compute the derivatives of this function or this neural network. All of those had single neurons. They're pretty easy to do. But last year was the first time where we had this open book exam. So I think it'd be very straightforward to even just re-implement the network in PyTorch and find its gradient. So instead, we asked this question, which is trying to get at the same optimization process and so on. So here, for those of you who didn't read this question, there's this guy, Erwin, who wants to train an autoencoder to learn representations of sentences. So an autoencoder, we didn't cover these in the class, but basically it gets some input. It learns this very small bottleneck representation of that input, like a much lower dimensional representation. And then from that lower dimensional bottleneck, it tries to reconstruct the original input. So this is an autoencoder. Its goal is to reconstruct its input. And so in this case, Erwin's input is an average of word embeddings that correspond to a particular sentence. So his input is a single vector A, which is the averaged word embedding of all of the tokens in the sentence. So is that clear? That's his input. And that's also what he's trying to reconstruct. So he gets A, which is dimensionality 128. It's a 128 dimensional vector. He projects it to 10 dimensions using a linear layer. So now you have vector B, which is this bottleneck vector. It only has 10 dimensions. So he's losing a lot of information about A when he does this. The idea is that hopefully this vector B will capture all of the important parts about the sentence, which will allow him the best chance of reconstructing the full sentence from this bottleneck. So after he gets his bottleneck, he starts the reconstruction process, which essentially just applies another linear layer, this time to project B back into 128 dimensions. And that's this A prime that he's produced. And then his objective function is just to make A and A prime as close to each other as possible using the square loss. So we saw the square loss. It was the very first loss function that we saw. Okay, so this is the setup. And all of these parameters, the word embeddings, the W1 and W2 that are doing these projections, these are all initialized randomly and trained from scratch. So there's no pre-training done here. And he has 1,000 different sentences. So when he starts training this, he observes that the model quickly converges to a training loss of 0, like exactly 0. That should make you immediately suspicious. So perhaps his network has overfit somehow. But he thinks that his model works. So he uses his test set. He takes a few sentences and tries to extract their bottleneck vectors. So maybe he can use those for transfer learning or something like that. But he finds that all of those vectors are identical. So the question is, what happened here? So the idea is that this is an optimization process that is not guaranteed to learn what Irvin wants it to learn, right? He wants that bottleneck representation B to contain all of the important parts of the original word embedding average or sum or whatever it was. The sum of the word representations. However, a trivial way to solve this optimization is just to make all of your word embeddings the same, right? You can make them all 0, and then when you project to B, B will also be a vector of zeros, and when you project back to A prime will also be a bunch of zeros. So if your input and your output are all zeros, then your loss is going to be 0, and you trivially minimize this objective without actually learning anything about the input sentences. And so that is what happens. If you implement this in PyTorch, this is going to happen, subject to your optimization choice. This used to happen a lot before we had pre-trained word vectors in these autoencoder style setups. So yeah, this one requires you to think a little bit about what the actual optimization goal is and how, when you start training this model, what are some different ways the model can do to minimize the objective that you've set up. Yeah.
So what's stopping, like, even in pre-training, you're doing the pre-training process when they have large amounts of data, the code that you want. What's stopping a language model from not suffering the same issue?
Okay, so the question is, even let's say we're pre-training a language model, what is to stop the model from collapsing to some degenerate solution like this? The objective in language modeling is very different, right? We are not trying to reconstruct some input. We actually have a different label of the word that we're trying to predict at every time step. So there is no trivial solution so imagine if your representation was always 0 in a language model. You feed it to a softmax layer, and you're trying to predict the identity of the next word, right? Assign high probability to the ground truth next word. But that next word is always changing word by word. So some trivial solution like this will never work. So if you had, actually an interesting question, if your representation was exactly the same at every time step in a language model, what would happen? That's a question for all of you. Well, so remember that your language model, your softmax layer, will be producing a distribution over the vocabulary for the next word. So if the representation that goes into the softmax layer is exactly the same at every time step, something would happen. What would happen? Okay, so one answer is you get random probabilities. It'll be uniform across the whole vocabulary. Well, remember that this is a distribution over the entire vocabulary. So where would all the probability go? We have one, it'll be uniformly distributed over all the tokens, the types in the vocabulary. Another, it'll be all concentrated on one word. Any other ideas? So you're learning this. Let's assume that you chop off everything about the language model except the softmax layer. And the input to this softmax layer is identical no matter what word you're at. But you're always trying to predict the next word. So you were pretty close. The model would learn the unigram distribution of your training corpus, right? Because some words occur more frequently than others. It can learn to encode this pattern in the weights of the softmax layer. So it can do better than random or uniformly assigning the probability, but it can't do better than the unigram distribution, right? Because it has no knowledge about the actual contexts that are appearing in the, okay, that would have been a good exam problem. Maybe for next year. All right, so question 4, let's see if we have any 2 questions. Okay, so this one was asking about, it was basically testing, this first question at least, testing your knowledge of BERTs, like subword, tokenization, right? Basically the premise here is that Voldemort puts a sentence, Harry Potter's social security number is mask, and then asks the model to predict what goes into the mask token. Of course, a social security number like this is not going to be in the subword vocabulary of the model, right? Because this is definitely not common enough to get all these merge operations in BPE to form this single number. So it's much more likely that this number will be broken down into like a bunch of different subwords. And so actually, if Voldemort wanted the model to at least be able to predict this number, he would have had to put multiple mask tokens in following this this prefix to at least give the model a chance to predict the social security number. However, this is still not a great way of producing a sequence of tokens, right? The problem with doing this in BERT is that if you have multiple mask tokens, the prediction at each mask token will be independent of the prediction at all of the previous and all the subsequent mask tokens. So BERT by itself is not a good method for generating text due to this reason. However, the basic issue here was that the model was not even capable of producing a social security number because of the tokenization that was used. Yeah?
Since this question is saying that we are training the model from scratch, what's stopping us from adding the social security number as a user?
Yeah, you could do that. It says everything else was kept the same, including the data preprocessing and hyperparameters. So the vocabulary was also the same in this. But yes, you could, and I think in one of the following questions, he adds this token, maybe, I forget, but he modifies the vocabulary in some way. That was not acceptable here, though. Okay, so question 2 then was, he fixed the subword problem, so now he has like multiple subwords that he's predicting, but he's not able to memorize this single number that he wants. So he, he modifies the data set here. So he adds 30 copies of this sentence, Harry Potter's social security number is 53, blah, blah, blah. He adds 30 copies of this to BERT's training data, and then pre-trains the whole model again on like Wikipedia plus these 30 fake Harry Potter sentences. And it still doesn't work. And basically what we are trying to go for here is that you're still using the original masking process of BERT, so it's not guaranteed that, it's not at all guaranteed that the social security number is getting masked at all during this pre-training process because you're randomly choosing 15% of all of the words. And one simple way that he could possibly improve is just by modifying the masking process. So instead of masking 15% of all possible words, why don't you mask out all numbers whenever they occur, or mask out all contiguous spans of numbers, because that's what he would get with his subword tokenized social security number. Okay, any questions on this? I mean, this is not to say that it would actually work, but it would have a better chance of working if he did this. So finally, he did all of this stuff, and it actually worked. And his model was producing 5, 3, 7, blah, 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 whenever it was given this input. So with the multiple mask tokens. So he was happy, but then he realized that it had kind of overfit to this specific prompt. Yeah.
I was just wondering if when masking out, you're saying the entire sequence of numbers.
Yeah. Wait, sorry, say that again?
Are we masking the entire sequence?
You mean in the solution to 4.2?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you mask out something like a social security number, we've already established that that would be a sequence of multiple subwords. If you want to have a chance of predicting the entire number correctly, you probably want to mask out the entire mask sequence, so all of the mask tokens that correspond to that single number.
Is that your subword tokenization should also
So here you're not changing your subword tokenization.
what makes it generate a longer subword than what might be in your example? Like, why would that entire long sequence be in your vocabulary?
The long sequence is not in your vocabulary, but it's
There's only one mask there.
there's one mask in the original setup, but because this one mask, there's no, as you say, there's no type in our vocabulary that corresponds to this huge number. There is a sequence of subwords that this number gets broken down into, right? Maybe it gets broken down into the digits. So 5, 3, 7, 8, 2, 9, 7, 3, 4. These are all separate time steps of the model. Like they're individual subwords that make up this big number. So all of that will be, put into a contiguous sequence of, I think like, 9 mask tokens here. Yeah. Okay, so here he's unable to actually produce the correct number when he changes the prompt, right? The prefix that he's feeding into the model. So when he changes it even slightly from Harry Potter's social security number to like a paraphrase, well, also adding the word unskilled, it's no longer predicting the right subwords anymore that correspond to the social security number. And that's because the model just memorized the training data instance. It didn't actually understand what the meaning of this context was. Yeah. Yeah. You mean if you have like paraphrases of this context included? Yeah. Possibly, yeah. But it's unclear if you add then other people and switch it from Harry Potter to someone else, if it would generalize there. So you'd actually need quite a diverse data set for the model to generalize properly. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. We have about 20 minutes. Maybe I'll just try and scan through the other midterms to see if there are any problems particularly worth mentioning. So I'll skip over these multiple choice ones, although some of them do contain things that are relevant to what we talked about. So you should look through the multiple choice. I'll tell you right now that there is not going to be a question like this with a network and ask you to compute the derivatives. So you should still know how, maybe I shouldn't have said that. You should still know how to do this, but we might have a question that asks about backprop-like things, like the autoencoder question, but it won't be like this. Yeah, definitely shouldn't have said that. Okay, this question was actually quite tricky, and also it could look a lot like things that you see on the midterm. So here, you're given a left to right language model, like we've seen many times before, but you're asked to perform the task of text infilling, which means it's similar to masked language modeling, right? So you have text of the prefix, you have text of something that follows, and then you have like a big masked sequence of tokens in the middle. So it could be something like, you know, John went to the mask, he bought a car or something. And then you have to have the model fill in what goes in the middle. Okay, so first of all, BERT is not a good solution for solving this task, as we've already mentioned, because it will predict each of those mask tokens independently of all of the other ones. So here we have a left to right language model that's trying to do the same thing. Unfortunately, you don't get to train it at all. So this left to right language model has been pre-trained on some corpus like Wikipedia for left to right language modeling. And now you want to repurpose it for this infilling task. The question is asking, how do you do that? All you know about this missing chunk in the middle is that it's between 1 and k tokens long. And so the first question combines a couple of different concepts together. So first, it's asking you to produce the missing token sequence with the highest probability. So it's not asking you for an approximation of this, right? Like something you might get with beam search is, you know, not the exact argmax, but maybe some high probability sequence. This is asking you for the single sequence with the highest probability. The only way to do this is to enumerate all possible sequences that could fill in that missing piece. And because this is infilling, you have to measure the probability of the entire sequence with each of these candidate sequences that you enumerate in the middle. So this is insanely slow, right? If I have between 1 and k tokens, every candidate, so let's say I have a k token long blank. Now I have v to the k different possible choices that could go in here. For each of these choices, I have to put it into the language model in that missing context and measure the probability of the entire sequence, and then find the one that has the highest probability. So that is the answer to this first question. Extremely slow, yeah. Not necessarily. So the thing I just said was if you assume the blank is k tokens long, you would have to do the exact same process for blanks that are 1, 2, 3, up till k minus 1 tokens long. So for every different value of the size of the blank, you have to enumerate all possible combinations of words that could fill in the blank and then measure the probability. Yeah. Yeah, you don't know which length it is. No, so there could be a, you know, k token long completion that actually gives you a higher probability than a 1 token blank. There's no need to do the scaling. Okay, so the second question we can skip over. It's basically asking, is this slower than greedy decoding? It's obviously much slower because you have to enumerate everything. And then the third question is asking you exactly why you can't use BERT to solve this problem. And, you know, like, here's a good example. Sarah went mask, and put on her safety goggles. If you put this into BERT and look at the prediction at every mask token, again, you're missing context at every mask token about the actual word that occurs at all of the other mask tokens. So this is not a good solution. One way to fix this is to incrementally do this mask prediction. So you feed in this whole sequence. You look at the prediction for the first mask token, you sample something, and then let's say you sample 2, the word 2. Then you do another pass, you feed in Sarah went to mask, and put on her safety goggles. you do it for the next mask, and so on. So you can do this incrementally. Still not great, but that's a better solution than just doing all the blanks at once. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going back to the voting on question. So over there, wouldn't we have the blank as 10 consecutive masks?
Yeah, that's right. If each subword is a digit and there are no like multi-digit subwords.
There would be that problem there.
Yeah, but we assume that so I think a social security number is always 10 digits. So there's like, he knows the value of the length of the.
Each digit does not have context of what the other digit was.
Yes, that's a problem.
Wouldn't be able to memorize it in that question when we did say.
Oh no, it still could, because remember it has a position embeddings as well. So if it's memorizing, it could know that if I see this context, the word at position 1 would have this value, position 2, 3, 4, and so on. But there's no way it's going to generalize from this kind of data.
And it would depend on how many examples, the same example that you're using.
Yeah. All right. Great. Oh, this one was also good. Okay, we are running out of time though. So, anyone have questions on this problem that looked at it before? So this is asking you if you have a recurrent neural network machine translation set up, and you want to add attention to the decoder side as well as the cross attention. How do you do that? Maybe we don't have to go into the details, but if anyone has questions on, yeah. Oh, the third part of this? Yes.
The opposite that we are assuming that we do this computation after all the others. Does that mean after all the keyboard side?
Yes. So if you look at the equation here, the attention distribution, sorry, the predicted distribution of the next word is a function of this d sub I, which is a decoder's current hidden state. S sub I think, is the source attention representation. And then T sub I is the target representation. But the point is that D sub I does not depend on the target attention representation based on the equations that we've defined. So you can compute all of the D sub I's using the recurrent neural network update, and only then compute the attention at every token in parallel using the mask matrix that we've seen. Yeah, this was a little tricky. This whole exam we gave in class with a closed book, and it was a disaster. So, right. Okay, so at this point, I think it might be worthwhile to go on the iPad and just overview like the language models, operations, training, test time, unless there are particular exam questions that someone wants to look at. Oh, that's a good question. So, I forgot to repeat questions. Sorry, YouTube people. Okay, so the question is, how would you prevent that autoencoder from collapsing to the degenerate solution? One answer would be if you initialize the model with pre-trained word embeddings and kept them fixed, so you're not optimizing one side of the input side of the model, then it can no longer collapse to this kind of degenerate solution, because the target that you're reconstructing is always a non-zero, non-identical target. That was generally the solution that people applied when they were doing these things. Yeah. Oh, the question is, for any arbitrary question, what is the guideline for the answer length? As you can see, the answers that I wrote are extremely short. I would definitely expect more information if you want partial credit. Also, for the question that asks you to build your model and describe the pre-processing and so on, we expect sufficient detail for every single component that we ask for. So many people for that question were writing like a couple paragraphs at least. But yeah, there's no fixed length that we expect. You would get full credit if you wrote like a few words that directly matched the answers here, but that's kind of risky, so I wouldn't recommend it. Yes?
There will be no need to include images in our explanation for any complex.
Yeah, you don't need to include images. There at least will be no need to include images. All right, so when you say the entire probability is that computed as a product of the top softmax for each time step k, yes. I forget what exactly I was referring to here, and I don't know what the top softmax means. I assume you mean the final layer which gets fed to the softmax. Okay, we got some kind of spammer. All right, so let me switch over to the iPad. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to clarify is the differences between language model training versus test time, and then also kind of, oh, right, I forgot about that. Yes, thank you. Okay. And yeah, also where the evaluation comes into play here and how all those decoding algorithms interface. So first of all, if we're doing training time, let's just draw like an RNN language model so I don't have to do all the queries and keys. But we had this, like students opened their books. Oh, too long. So in our standard language model, right, we have some embedding for each of these words. We project those to some hidden state, and then at every time step here, the model is learning to predict the next word. Predict opened. Once we predict opened, we predict there. Here we're predicting books, and here we're predicting like the end of sequence token. Right, so this is the general training process of our language model, and we can do this all in a transformer in parallel because we know the ground truth next word at every single time step because it's in our training data, right? So remember, to train these models, we compute the cross entropy loss at each of these time steps. We average it across all of the tokens in the sequence, and then that's our loss function that we compute the gradients and do our updates and so on against. But the important thing that I want to emphasize is that at training time, we can parallelize in the transformer because we have access to the entire ground truth. That's why that mask is important at training time, right? So training time, full access to ground truth sequences. And our training objective is maximize log likelihood of the data, or minimize the negative log likelihood, right, which is what we saw. Okay, but what happens at test time is different. So at test time, and this is what I wanted to focus on, at test time, no access to ground truth data. So at test time, let's say I feed my model students open, and I wanted to generate a couple more words after this. I have already trained my model, right? I'm no longer updating my model. I trained it using the process that we just detailed. So at test time, how do I produce a token given that I have this as my input to the model? What do I do? What are some things I could do? Sure, so I could use any of my sampling or decoding algorithms that we talked about, right? So to produce next word or next words, I can use decoding algorithms like greedy search, beam search, top K sampling, and so on. Right? So I can get a sequence like students opened their backpacks at test time simply through one of these sampling processes, right? I could also get students opened and closed their laptops. Right? At test time, I don't have a ground truth sequence. I can produce any number of things using whatever decoding algorithm I want. And so the process so far is training, then so we train using ground truth data. Only then do we, when we move to test time, we have to use a decoding algorithm. And only after we apply some of these decoding algorithms can we perform evaluation using metrics like blue score or rouge score or stuff like that. So I think this was a big point of confusion for many of you. So let's say I'm doing machine translation, right? So I train my model on parallel ground truth translations. So I have a trained machine translation model. Then at test time, I get only one side of the input, right? The source sentence. I don't know what the target sentence is. So I apply beam search to my trained machine translation model, and I get a candidate translation. Only after I produce a candidate translation that ends with the end of sequence token can I compute the blue score against the reference translation to find out how good my machine translation system is doing. So there's this pipeline, right? There's training, then decoding at test time, and finally applying these sequence level evaluation metrics. So many of you were asking, why don't I just train my model using the blue score? The answer is you can only compute the blue score when you've fully generated a sequence, right? You don't have the ability to compute the blue score at a token level like that and then backprop through it. That is a whole different objective than the negative log likelihood that we've observed throughout this class. So, okay, hopefully that is more clear. Yes?
I was going to ask.
Oh, okay, yeah, go for it.
If you're comparing different models, do you have to use the same coding method of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if you're comparing different models for, say, machine translation, should you use the same decoding algorithm? And if you want to do a scientific comparison, then yes, because some decoding algorithms perform much better than others. So for example, in machine translation, beam search is much better than greedy decoding. So if you use beam search with model B and compare it to greedy search with model A, it's not clear if you're evaluating the decoding algorithm or the model performance. Yes. So we use this term decoding algorithm to refer to the way in which we at test time, produce a sequence from our language models. There are many different types of methods that we could use to produce a sequence. We could do greedy search, we could do sampling, whatever, but we need to use something to get the sequence that we want. Remember that none of these methods are recovering the sequence with the highest probability, right? Because we're not enumerating this entire output space. So all of these things are just approximations. Yes. Yes, all of these methods are relying on the output of the softmax layer, the probability distribution, to control what we're generating. It's just a matter of trading off diversity for more relevance to the prompt, perhaps, or the input. Other questions? Oh, we've gone on too long. Okay, so please come to my office hours tomorrow if you have any burning questions. Happy to answer. Otherwise, good luck with your studying, and yeah, look forward to all the many Piazza posts the next week.